One tray says important and urgent, and that has to be dealt with immediately. Another tray says not important and not urgent, so that goes to the bottom of the pile. Now there's a third tray that says important but not urgent. And usually, this is where crisis preparedness comes in. It's very important. You know it's important. At the back of your mind, it's something you have to get to. But it's never on the top of your urgent list. Unless a crisis happens, then it's the only thing that you should concentrate on for the next months. So this is some pushback that you might encounter in practice. Every crisis is different. Planning is impossible. Time and resource consuming, never a high priority. And then there's a tendency to kind of leave these things, protocol things, to junior staff. Really not advisable because a lot of the key decisions have to be signed off by senior management. And but the tendency is to, okay, let's leave protocols to junior staff. So I have here a quote from a former US Army General and President. So in preparing for battle, I always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. And let me share a story again from Asia. Excuse me. So my colleague was, even though we run training programs, we are not sitting supervisors. Sometimes just by observing the dynamics of the people that we run courses for, you get a pretty good idea of what's going on. So in this particular case, we were running a crisis preparedness course, which was about coming out of the handbook, the crisis handbook, right? And the course was requested by the central bank of that country. And so when we got the participant list, we realized that there were only central bankers on that list. And so we came back to them and we asked them, the whole purpose of this course was to involve other safety net participants. So are you going to invite supervisors? That was our impression. Are you going to invite your deposit insurer? And the answer was no. We are not going to invite them. And so we probed and dug, and we didn't. And then finally, it dawned on us. You see, the background is there were two guys who were in the running for governor of the central bank. These two gentlemen, one of them became the governor, and the other one lost and became the head of the supervisory agency. So the dynamics were such that the tone from the top was, we don't talk to each other. So it was difficult. Of course, we can't push. So the whole course happened with just the central banks. And that crisis binder had all these things that, in this crisis, the supervisor shall do this, without ever telling the supervisor that was what the central bank wanted them to do. But this story had a happy ending, so my colleague went back a few years later, and she said that, hey, the heads of the supervisory agency and the central banks, I saw them on the same panel. They're actually quite collegial, but the catch is they are actually different guys. Yeah. So both heads had left, and the new heads got along with each other, and things happened. But this is not an ideal situation. The whole point of formalizing things is to go beyond big men and personalities, right? Is to formalize protocols such that in crisis, regardless of the personalities involved, the crisis plan works. Okay. So let's go straight into, I talked about a crisis binder, you might have other names for it. It's basically a handbook for contingency planning, and we do run a program on this. So from CP4, this kind of common document promotes the formalization of protocols among the safety net participants. What exactly is in it? It's a handbook to connect the dots among the financial safety net participants, roles and responsibilities, protocols, confidentiality, and external communications to media. I think yesterday we talked about I think on the first day, I think Mr. Muhammad raised this question about the continuum. Where does the role of the central bank as lender of last resort stop? And then when does resolution and that discussion happen. So I've just put it on a continuum here. There are interlocking decisions. So, I mean, let's start with the situation where a firm is in trouble, right? Before going to the second bullet, which is an assessment that the supervisor might usually make, is this a solvency or liquidity issue? That's usually not the first port of call. The first port of call should be the bank itself. That's what their recovery plan is for. So the supervisor should definitely know that the firm is heading for trouble. What are the remedial steps? The first port of call would be the firm's recovery plan, especially for big firms. But still, there is an assessment that has to be made. Is this a liquidity or solvency issue? And then interlocked with that, is this firm systemic? What are the contagion channels? We talked about no bank is too big to fail, no bank is too small to matter. And this is an interlocking decision because it leads to circumscribing what resolutions or recoveries you might want to put in place for that institution, and then the communications. So as a deposit insurer, depending on your mandate, you might be involved right at the beginning, right? At the preventative stage when in supervising the bank, when the firm runs into trouble. I think the last thing you want to be is to be left right at the end, where everything else fails, and then, okay, the request just comes for payout. So these are very important interlocking decisions that need to be assigned to participants in the financial safety net. Who is making this call that a bank is about to fail or not? Who is making the call on whether the contagion, is such that you have to take extreme measures in terms of liquidity assistance? Where does the central bank come in? If the bank is systemic, is the central bank prepared to relax its collateral rules for emergency liquidity assistance? So there are many, many decisions, interlocking decisions, that requires the safety net participants to have a very clear view in advance of what their roles and responsibilities are. If I might have the next slide. So I've just put up what we would like to see in a crisis binder. Of course, it varies country to country. I would just say that details matter a lot in contingency planning. This is moving from high-level principles to nuts and bolts. So on the left, this is tracing through contagion channels, right? Systemically important financial institutions, the first port of call should be their recovery plans. If they run into trouble, well, what have they put in their recovery plan? Are they raising capital? Are they tapping on lines of liquidity, not the central bank, but other lines of liquidity? And this requires some understanding of the exposures and shareholdings. This might be done within the supervisor, it might be done within the central bank, it varies among countries. And the second pillar is really, in the crisis binder, is like who is doing what? What are the boundaries of your legal powers? What are your decision-taking procedures, info sharing protocols? Another story, when we were running this program, crisis simulation, it was in a country where most of the participants were not, English was not their first language. So when we were running this simulation and all the emails were flying around, there was a need for the participant group that was playing the central bank to request some information from the supervisor. And one of the ladies in the group took serious exception to the level of English in the email that was her group mates were going to send to the other party. So I think she took about 1 hour to clean up the email, to put it in full prose and proper English and good grammar and all that. By that time, the simulation had moved on. So, the point of this story is if you really need requests to come to you in a template that says, letter such and such, pursuant to section such and such of the Act. Why not just put it in a template and stick it in the binder so that when crisis comes, you are not tripped up by really things like that, like grammar, like legal drafting, which section am I referring to. So templates really help a lot, and this is the nuts and bolts of crisis binders that people don't really want to think about in peacetime, but can come in very, very helpful in a crisis. Communications, we talked about it. Who is going to put up press statements? Who are the press officers? In my home country in Singapore, when we went through the global financial crisis in 2009, we thought it was very important to have a single face, like a face, that is recognizable to the public and the media. And this is about controlling the flow of information so that you don't affect market confidence. One message, one face, single point of contact. And ultimately the question that you will have to answer as deposit insurers, supervisors, central banks would be, will the depositors get their money back if this bank fails? Now, who's going to put up that press statement? Is it the role of the deposit insurer? Is it the role of the supervisor to comment on the state of the bank or not comment? Whose responsibility is it? It's worth thinking about. I'm sure you have a lot of experience to share in that. And the last part is cross-border, right? Copies of MOUs that have been signed, maybe there should be annexes in that, or at least a list that you have an MOU with this particular deposit insurer or home supervisor and the contact points. So when I talk about crisis binder, I'm really talking about like details like these that are very, very useful for the safety net participants to sort out in advance of any trouble. So that's in peacetime. Hopefully those protocols are established in peacetime. And the next question is, having drafted a crisis binder or these protocols, how do you know that they work? How do you know that they work? How do you test them? Of course, crisis is the best time to test them, but we are not going to manufacture a crisis. So I guess the next best is to play some sort of war games, as I said. So EAD CP6 has advice on this, has guidance on this. The DI's role in contingency planning and crisis management, right? The deposit insurer should have in place effective contingency planning and crisis management policies and procedures. And this is the joint responsibility of all safety net participants. And essential criterion 6.4 recommends that the deposit insurer participates in regular contingency planning and simulation exercises. So the next part of the presentation, I'll move into what Toronto Centre has done by way of these simulation programs. We started running these programs for countries since 2008. And to date, we have run about 120 of them. So I guess over 10 years, it will be average one a month. And we started off running these as national or regional, national programs for a country, and then we opened it up to the region. We started with banking, scenarios in banking, and then we opened it up. We had our program leaders, who are ex-supervisors, write scenarios for insurance, for securities, and also for kind of cross-sectorial. So these can be standardized simulations or customized, and I'll explain what that means later. And it's really part of our our methodology of being very interactive in our training. The next slide, please. Sorry. So actually, another interesting story, when we first ran this program, it was in first simulation that we ever ran was on October 6, 2008. And I think we had about 25 participants then, but on the day itself, there was one participant who didn't show up. And we tried calling, my colleagues tried calling, and we just could not reach him, so we were wondering what happened to this gentleman. Can you guess what country he's from? October 6, 2008. He was from Iceland. Iceland. And actually, the crisis had already started for him, unfortunately, on that day. With the collapse of, there were 3 banks in Iceland, all of them eventually collapsed. So I think for this particular gentleman, the crisis simulation exercise came too late. It's a useful, simulation is a very useful way of testing these protocols. What are we testing? Now, I just explain what simulations mean. The typical one that we would run for banks is over a full day. The participants will be divided into groups. You can play the supervisor, and then embedded in the supervisor would be resolution authority and deposit insurer. You have another group that plays the central bank. And then we have role players, which are made of TC staff, personnel like myself, and our trainers. So I will play the media, can play cross-border insurer, I can play the finance ministry. And it starts with a few stages. It starts with, let's say, a banking crisis. The participants are fed emails that describe the financial situation of this bank. It can be hypothetical, or it can be based on real banks. It depends on the needs of the country, how they want to customize it. But let's say it's hypothetical. So everything is delivered through email, and then at certain points, they have to come and basically brief the Minister of Finance, which is us, the role players. What's the recommendation? And it follows the continuum that I've described, which is this bank is in trouble. Sorry, please go back. This bank is in trouble. Is it liquidity or solvency problem? Is it systemic? What's the contagion channel? So what is your option? Are you going to recommend to the central bank to offer emergency liquidity assistance? Are you going to let it fail? So these are the decisions that we are trying to test. So at each stage, more information will be fed to the participants, and they'll have to make clear decisions at each point. So that is the content part of the simulation. We also try to mimic in a small way the process, which is the stress and the adrenaline that participants would experience in a crisis. Although by the end of the day, everybody's happy and they go home. But still, we try and do that by bombarding the participants with a lot of financials and information, some of which are actually not relevant. So it takes practice and skill to actually pick out the financials that actually matter to your decision. I'll talk a little bit more about it later. We try and mimic the process of communications with the media. So I would play the media. If I send a request to the supervisor group, I don't get a response back via email, I will write a nastier press release, a nastier report, and then the pressure builds up. So I quite enjoy playing the media, I must say. But this is what we try and mimic in the simulation. So there's enormous time pressure. The whole game finishes in one day, and we have a debrief the next day. So my perspective here is to just share some observations that we have accumulated over the years running these simulations. Even though these are simulations, I think the lessons that they bring out are really quite valuable. I think the first one is just delays in information sharing. We have the supervisors group, deposit insurers, and the central banks. And they just don't share information with each other. And underlying that, of course, is a little bit unfair to the participants because they have been thrown in this group. They have to work out the protocols on the fly. Okay. I mean, in a real life situation, they would have had time to work out the protocols and the crisis binder. But delays in information sharing is is a big one. The other observation is what I call analysis paralysis, particularly on the part of supervisors, I think, and I can completely sympathize with that. Because in the simulation, you are called upon to make a judgment call. This bank, these are the financials, is it going to fail? It's a very, very difficult judgment call to make. There is incomplete information. So when we were running the simulation, a lot of the participants would come and request a lot of additional financials. We can't make the decision. They're bogged down in numbers, and then the time is ticking, right? The simulation is such that if you don't make a decision, depositors run. You're going to be a worse off scenario in terms of your liabilities and asset structure. So analysis paralysis maybe the underlying root cause could be many. It could be lack of empowerment, lack of clarity in decision-making structures. The other observation that I have in relation to analysis paralysis is with regard to supervisors again. Again, I sympathize. There is a tendency to find out who is at fault, which is actually not really relevant to the decisions that are being tested. So in the simulation, you will have the supervisory team saying that, oh, did the CEO say this? Did the CFO say that? Is there a fraud here? And they ask for information. I mean, all this is true, all this is important, but it doesn't help you in the decision that needs to be made. Is this bank illiquid or insolvent, right? I mean, the blame can come later, the court cases can come later. So I think analysis paralysis is a way of maybe a psychological tendency to delay decision making. In one jurisdiction, again in Asia, I found this particularly pronounced, asking for a lot of information. And the background is because the supervisors don't have much legal protection in their law. So they have a history where the assistant governor has been hauled off to jail for bailing out a bank. There was a criminal prosecution, and he was actually hauled off to jail. And the officers had no legal immunity in their law. And under such a context, it's understandable why people don't want to make certain key decisions. So I offer that for you. I mean, it's as just an observation. No coordinated response to media or to political pressure. The Ministry of Finance is part of the safety net. The Ministry of Finance is also a politically elected figure. In the simulation, he or she will keep pushing. He or she might even propose that let's raise the deposit insurance limit now. Because my constituents are bugging me about it, and I don't want to lose my seat. So those are, and if there isn't like a coordinated response to that, it's very, very easy to be bowled over, I think, by political pressure. So I leave that with you. Those are some lessons from the crisis simulations. I just want to talk about a relatively new kind of simulation we have done in the past few years. And these are really cross-border or region-wide simulations. So these are more complex. Maybe I'll just move on to the next slide. It's easier to explain. So this is the one that we did in last year. Excuse me. It's a region-wide simulation because it's conducted for 8 countries in the Nordic-Baltic region. You have them named, Iceland, Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark, etc. And it took Toronto Centre a year to customize the simulation. For this group of countries, they had a couple of banks that have substantive cross-border operations. And they wanted to use these 2 banks as a kind of a model. Of course, there was some masking of the data to run the simulation. if these two banks run into problems, what are the responses? So this was a massive exercise. It took place over 2 days. There were 31 authorities involved. 31 authorities, 300 people. And they all sat in their home country. The control room was in Sweden. And I think over the 2 days, I have here that there were 1,600 email messages exchanged. So it's a massive exercise, and but also I think a lot of learning came out of that exercise of what to do, what not to do for the individual country authorities. The first issue that came up, even when we were designing this, was judgments and share this sort of data across borders. I mean, just a very simple question: what email do I use? How can I be assured that it doesn't leak or it doesn't get hacked? So very practical issues like this are thrown up by simulations. So just move on, please. So just key takeaways. I think my main message is that coordination among safety net participants in peacetime, some sort of shared crisis binder would be very helpful. To test that through simulations. I'm sure deposit insurers do a lot of contingency testing within yourself, right? Business continuity, payout processes, communications, it's all necessary, well and good, but it's not sufficient. So there's a need to test coordination of other safety net participants. I think Violetta was saying that the deposit insurance fund in Kosovo was designed for a failure of 2 small banks or 1 medium-sized bank. Well, in the first place, is there a common understanding among the safety net participants of what 1 medium-sized bank means? Is there some understanding if this kind of bank fails, this would be the preferred resolution option, or there would be payout? And also those kind of things is important for deposit insurers, regardless of whether you have a narrow or broad mandate, to discuss in advance and and to understand the likely approach of the resolution authority or the supervisors if a certain bank runs into problems. So with that, I thank you very much, and I'll just close with one slide. These are the other programs that we do, and if there's any interest in partnerships, I'm available to discuss. And I look forward to your questions for the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the presentation. As I said at the beginning, this is a very important issue a very important area for insurance entities which are just commencing activities or have yet to go through process. I would like to open the floor for discussions. If you have any questions, if you want to make additional contribution or clarification, the floor is open.